Good evening. Welcome. I understand that we have a few empty seats because there's a protest outside. So we're going to talk about pain and suffering, and there are people who are in pain and suffering, and then those who are trying to get through those to get to the Trinity Forum Duke Divinity School event. I'm Dan Struble. I'm an Associate Dean for External Relations at Duke Divinity School, and I am delighted to be here with you tonight. We have an excellent evening prepared for you. You're going to meet one of our very best professors and one of our very best graduates. I also want to introduce to you a couple of people. First, Dennis and Lisa Campbell. Dennis and Lisa, would you stand, please? Dennis was dean at the Duke Divinity School for 15 years. So we're delighted they could join us tonight. I also like to have Peter McDonald stand. Peter is with the McDonald Agape Foundation, and they help sponsor tonight's event. He's also on our board of visitors, so we're so thankful. And Duke Divinity School has now co-sponsored 3 events. This is our 3rd event with Trinity Forum. And our first event was with Jeremy Begbie on theology and music. And Jeremy played the piano and sang, well, sort of sang, he mostly talked. And we had a wonderful turnout. We had N.T. Wright, who is a good friend of Richard Hayes, who until about a year and a half ago was our dean, and the people turned out en masse for them. And tonight we have Ray Barfield and Mike Walrond, and I'm excited to have them come up. Both of them are storytellers, and Cherie will do the introduction, so I won't do that. But I want you all to know that Duke Divinity School is a phenomenal place. How many of you know Duke Divinity School personally because you've been there? All right, quite a few. That's great. And so those of you who have questions about Duke Divinity, seek out one of those folks who had their hands raised. But it's an amazing place. We have 650 students, 450 of whom are in the Masters of Divinity program. And they are studying to become pastors. And I don't know if you know about seminaries today, but most seminary grads don't go into the pastorate. But ours do. A majority of ours do. And then we also have a Doctor of Ministry, theology doctorate, a PhD, and we have a number of master's degrees as well. We have a Center for Theology, Medicine, and Culture, which Ray is part of, and I hope you'll ask him questions about that. We have a Center for Reconciliation that is involved in Asia and Africa and the United States, and we have some materials about that. We have it's a Methodist-based seminary, but we also have Anglican Episcopal House, so that those going into either the Anglican or the Episcopal Church get special formation in their tradition. Same with Baptist, same with Presbyterian and Reformed. So there is a lot to know about Duke Divinity School. I hope you will take the opportunity to come and ask one of us after the event. But now I'd like to introduce Cherie. Cherie, where are you? There she is! Cherie is the president of the Trinity Forum, and she makes all of this go, and we're so glad she's here. Come on up, Cherie.
I'm subtle that way. Just wanted to add my greetings to all of you and welcome to tonight's evening conversation on suffering and flourishing, persevering in faith in the midst of pain. As Dan said, we are honored and pleased to be able to partner yet again with Duke Divinity School to bring this series to you. As he mentioned, this is the 3rd in a 4-part series on the overarching theme of faith, formation, and flourishing. And we started off talking about music and beauty, and then went on to talk about the good life and the good news. And now we are going to be talking about suffering and pain. So thank you for sticking with us during this journey. Dan mentioned there were many special guests here. I also just want to add my thanks to Peter McDonald for his sponsorship of this series, as well as acknowledge some of our trustees in the room, Richard Miles and his wife Phoebe. We're delighted to have you here. And we're really delighted that each of you is here tonight and welcome you. Glad that you have come, especially on a night where I know it's fairly difficult to make your way through the maze of traffic, especially with the protest out there. If you had friends who wanted to come tonight but could not, we'll be recording tonight's evening conversation, which will be available on our website at www.ttf.org. Photos and commentary will be on our Facebook page, and you, of course, are very welcome to follow along and add your own commentary on Twitter at our Twitter feed at #TrinityForum. For those of you who are new to Trinity Forum or to Trinity Forum Evening Conversations, we work to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith, and to help equip and engage those leaders in engaging those great questions, to live and to lead more wisely, and ultimately to come to better know the author of the answers. And certainly, one of the great questions of life relates to our purpose here on earth, what we're here for, how we order our lives and loves, what it means to live wisely and well. And one of the great challenges to our hopes and our assumptions about what our life should be is pain and suffering. And while human suffering is universal, afflicting all of us at some point in different forms and perhaps to very different degrees, its presence is often met with denial or eager distraction. In its extremes, it can disorient, even degrade, as well as diminish. It often has a deep and dark gravitational pull, sucking the sufferer ever deeper into isolation and upending our assumptions about our place and our purpose in the world, or whether any of it even matters. While some turn to faith in the midst of pain for comfort, for reassurance, or for meaning, for others, the seeming senselessness of human suffering has led them to reject the idea of a benevolent God outright and assert the idea that while we may suffer senselessly without the notice, care, or presence of God, that while this idea may be painful in itself, at least has the bracing tonic of truth. But is it possible to live into one's purpose, to flourish as a human being, even in the midst of suffering? How does one make sense of trauma or persevere when all seems lost? What role does faith play in living fully, even when we are in pain? Now, of course, there are no easy or pat answers to such questions, but there may be wisdom to be gleaned from wrestling with them. And so tonight, we'll hear from two such wrestlers, both of whom have, from very different perspectives, deeply and courageously confronted and lived with suffering. Dr. Ray Barfield is a faculty member of the Duke University's Medical School as well as its Divinity School, where he works to bridge the gap between theology and medicine. He serves as a pediatric oncologist and directs the Pediatric Quality of Life and Palliative Care Program, a program that combines medical care, education, and research to benefit children with complex, chronic, or life-limiting disease. At the Divinity School, he develops courses and programs that address topics at the intersection of theology, medicine, and culture, as well as teaching courses in Christian philosophy. The Reverend Michael Walrond is the senior pastor of First Corinthian Baptist Church in Harlem, New York. Even in the midst of suffering from the chronic pain of sarcoidosis, he is one of the most sought-after preachers in the country. He's a board member of the National Action Network and serves as a trustee and adjunct faculty member at Chicago Theological Seminary. He's been a recipient of the Root 100 Award, a list of the top 100 most influential African Americans under the age of 45, and in 2015 was named as one of New York's most influential religious leaders. He was also appointed to head New York City's new Clergy Advisory Council in 2015 by Mayor Bill de Blasio. And of course, he received his MDiv from Duke Divinity School. We're delighted they both have joined us tonight to discuss a difficult topic, suffering and flourishing, perseverance and faith in the midst of pain. And so tonight, after short remarks by both Ray and Michael, we'll have a brief time of moderated discussion between them, followed by questions from the audience. Ray and Michael, welcome. Well, thank you to both of you for joining us. I'm not sure who wanted to start first with some brief thoughts.
Yes, I told Ray I have a back cleanup, so he can go ahead.
Ray, start us off on pain.
Me. Okay. Well, my name is Ray, and Michael and I have talked some about what we wanted to do tonight, and since we're talking about pain and suffering, which inevitably is also going to include discussion about dying. It's very hard to talk about pain and suffering deeply without also talking about our mortality. Since we're talking about those, we're talking about topics that neither one of us is going to have any final, pat, easy answers for. And so we wanted to spend most of the time, and we're very much looking forward to spending most of the time wrestling with y'all and with questions that come out of your own experience, your own concerns, your own fears. One of the things, I'm a pediatric oncologist, and so all my patients, the majority of my patients, I take care of some adults, but the majority of my patients are children. And that means that we have around a 70% cure rate, which means that 30% of my patients we can't cure, and they die. Well, I've learned from them that the only way forward in working through these difficult questions is to tell the truth. So we're going to be really trying to say true things. And if we get lost in the middle of trying to answer a question or wrestle with something, if I get lost, he'll pick it up. If he gets lost, someone else will pick it up. Because this is really difficult. Now, I can tell you that when I began my career doing primarily bone marrow transplant and doing research for a kind of childhood cancer called neuroblastoma that mostly affects kids under the age of 5. And in my first couple of years of practicing bone marrow transplant, we were using a novel approach to transplant that we were just figuring out, where we used the parent as the donor. These were for kids who had multiply relapsed cancers and who did not have another donor. And so they either came to transplant with us or they died. But because we were just learning how to do this new approach, we had a 40 to 50% mortality rate. And so I experienced an enormous amount of suffering and dying in a very short period of time. I experienced that. But the other thing that I experienced was my own sense of failure, incompetence, lostness, and an inability to grasp how, as a Christian physician, I was supposed to hold together in my mind the ideas of a benevolent, loving, and sovereign God and all of the suffering that I saw in front of me. Well, I'll tell you, since we're going to tell the truth tonight, that there came a very important crisis in my own life where I didn't want to stop believing. My whole life was centered around Jesus. I simply found myself in a situation where I didn't know how to bring the image of God that had meant so much to me into the same room with the image of all of these children who were suffering and who were in pain and who were dying. But I saw them concretely. And if I couldn't have both things in the room, well, I know this one's in the room, so this one's going to have to go. And I didn't want it to go. Believe me, this was as disorienting as anything could possibly be in my life when I began to realize that without thinking through or choosing, I simply wasn't able to believe. That's how I experienced myself at that point. I kept going to church. I kept taking the Eucharist. And when I would take the Eucharist, there were, I will tell you, times when I would feel something, I would feel a presence that I recognized. But as soon as I would walk back to the pew, I would go gray again. What I discovered in the course of that experience, in the course of the next 2 years as I worked through this, is that what had happened is not that I had become an atheist, not that I had gone dark on faith. Instead, what had happened is that the image of God that I had was too small. And that image it had served well for a time. But I had come to a place where I needed to grow into a deeper and perhaps riskier, vulnerable approach to openness to the reality of who God is. And what I realized as I moved through that process, as I rediscovered God, who had never left, but as I rediscovered what it is to be a Christian in the context of suffering and pain, and what it is to be faithful to an unfathomable God, I realized that the image that I had had, which had served wonderfully, which had been a deep source of consolation, and which had brought a great deal of light into my life, that at the point at which I would try to choose that image over an ever-growing relationship and knowledge with God, as C.S. Lewis says, further up and further in. At that point, this image became an idol. And we know what happens to idols in Scripture. They've got to be undone. And so what felt to me like a dawning atheism in my life wasn't. It was the destruction of an idol that was coming between me and a deeper understanding of God. And as I moved towards that, which was frightening and disorienting, I discovered a way to experience and think about suffering and pain and dying, even in the cauldron that I live in, which is mostly with children, but most certainly not with pat answers. Because in that process, God seemed more interested in giving me something different than a pat answer. God said, I'm going to be enough. Now, I'll tell you one last thing before I turn it over to Mike. There was a very comforting experience that I had about halfway into that particular stage of my journey, where I began reading Thomas Aquinas. Now, I wasn't Catholic. I had been raised Presbyterian, and I was dating a woman who wanted to be an Episcopal priest, who said, I can't imagine being married to someone who's not in the Episcopal Church. And so I quickly shifted over to the Episcopal Church because I'm a smart guy. But I was reading Thomas Aquinas, a new acquaintance with Thomas Aquinas, and the theologian for the Catholic Church. And I came across this line in the Summa Theologica, in which Thomas Aquinas said, and it stunned me to this day. He said, the deepest knowledge that we can have of God in this life is that we don't know what God is. That is coming from Thomas Aquinas. Now, Thomas Aquinas was not a pessimist about getting to know God. Thomas Aquinas was a realist about how deep and unfathomable God is. In another place, Thomas Aquinas calls God an abyss, but an abyss of light. And I can tell you that that was incredibly freeing to me because it allowed me to be honest as I came up against some very hard things. So that's my story, and that's what I'm hoping that we're going to do some of tonight.
Good, thank you. My story is a little different. My next birthday, I will be 46 years old. And at 10 years old, I was diagnosed with a condition known as sarcoidosis. At 10 years old, And I found this out on my 30th birthday. My wife had a surprise party for me, and my parents were there, and my father stood up to speak, and he started to cry. And I can count the times I've seen my father cry. Now, my parents were divorced at the time, and so I got nervous. I thought it meant they were getting back together. But he said, I want to share something with Michael that I've never shared, and we've never shared. And as he began to speak, my mother started crying. And my father said that, many of you know my son's condition and what he's dealt with in his life. He said, but I'm going to share something today that he doesn't know. He said, when he was 10 and they found out I had sarcoidosis, I had a tumor that had to be removed. And they told my parents that their 10-year-old son would probably not live to 13. And as I look back over my life, it made sense. My parents were overprotective. And I was miserable as a child because of that. But as a parent now of two children, one 25, one 22, when I look at my children, I do not know how I would handle if I were told by a doctor that my baby would not make it 3 more years. And so my condition, I'll talk more about it, has been extremely difficult in my years, extremely painful. There's a video about sarcoidosis on the internet. The title of the video is, "But You Don't Look Sick." Because very often those who suffer with sarcoidosis, you cannot see visible signs. But those who know about the disease, it is an extremely painful disease, almost daily living with pain and inflammation. And in a very quick, it is as if my immune system gets bad signals and says that there are parts of my body that are sick and nothing is wrong, and so it is as if my body attacks itself. And it attacks most large tissue organs like the lungs and others. But for me, I have had attacks on every organ in my body, and it has been unbelievable. 4 years ago, I went to Durham, North Carolina to preach a revival, a good old Baptist revival, in 3 nights. And so on the plane, boarding the plane, I felt a little sick, and I thought I was having a sarcoidosis episode. And when that happens, there's not much I can do. For me, it manifests itself. I get a fever, glands swell, I get shakes real bad, and I just have to suffer with it. Sometimes it can last 30 minutes. Sometimes it can last 5 hours. And so I was nervous because I had to preach. And long story short, I left New York on Wednesday to preach Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Wednesday, I felt sick, a little ill, and this was in 2012. By Friday, I was in the hospital. By Sunday, the doctors told me they did not know if I would make it because I had MRSA, and it was in my blood. It was septic. And so I'm here. I survived it, thanks to the care of some tremendous doctors at Duke Medical Center. But at the time, I was a columnist for one of the country's oldest African-American newspapers, the Amsterdam News, and I came out of that situation. And when they released me, I spent 9 days at Duke Medical Center. And when I went home, I wrote a column that was due the day I got back, and I still wrote. And so I want to just share it. It's about 3 minutes, and I'll share it to kind of give you an idea of what this has been like. And I wrote this 4 years ago, and I found it actually today. I went through the internet on the website of the newspaper and saw it. But I'll read it very quickly. And the title of the article I wrote was called Soul Music at the time. There are lyrics that languish within the unfathomable corridors of the soul, lyrics that are longing for release. Deep within all of us, there is music shaped by the rhythms of our lives. And that music and those lyrics often remain hidden, unknown, and untouched. The irony is that there's a desire to give birth to the harmonies that make us whole, but it is the labor and delivery that causes us to cringe. Pain is the resented midwife that makes giving birth to the music, the melody, and the lyrics so unpalatable. Pain is so despised that there are those who would rather recycle familiar rhythms then launch out into the deep unknown where new melodies reside. It is one of the supreme tragedies of life when individuals are so enamored of avoiding pain that they miss the opportunity to tap into what may be lying dormant in their soul. I know this sounds strange for some or absurd to some, but in my life, pain has been a constant companion. Once I got past the years of resentment, I learned that there are times when pain and painful experiences can be the conduit to hidden treasures that my soul was yearning to reveal. Isn't it amazing how revelations from the soul often come on the heels of experiences that have no reference point in our past? It is as if the deep places within, where music and new music resides, are best experienced in moments where there are no security blankets or familiar hiding places. Unfamiliar and uncharted pain often serves as an escort to those deep places within. I recently spent a week in a North Carolina hospital suffering from what is known as MRSA, a MRSA infection. There was bacteria in my blood and an infection in my leg. The experience was extremely painful, and now I must receive antibiotics intravenously for 2 weeks. I've never experienced anything quite like this, and there were moments when I wrestled with the absurdity of the whole situation. I had simply gone to North Carolina to preach, and 2 days later, I found myself in the hospital battling a life-threatening infection. I suffer from sarcoidosis and have spent much time in hospitals, but this was altogether different. My life was in jeopardy, and I was straining to make sense of what was happening. It was in the moment of praying and groping for understanding that I came to realize that maybe this experience was not to be understood, but experienced. How often have we experiences that have yielded transformative fruit, but we missed the moments of transformation and revelation because we were busy trying to make the situation make sense? In the process of trying to rationalize the experience, we missed the power of the experience. So there I was in the hospital bed, alleviated of any obligation to make sense of my condition. And I mustered the courage to experience the experience. Now that I'm back home and in recovery, I still trust that on the other side of this experience, my soul will yield music and lyrics that only pain could have birthed. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain." It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. So God, I'm listening. Thank you.
So Michael, we'll start with you and ask you to tease out a little bit more of what you talked about, in that it's very difficult for any human, really, to flourish without finding meaning in their experience. And yet, as you were just talking about, there's a difference between understanding and finding meaning, experiencing the experience. I think it's our drive to find meaning in our experiences that leads people often to offer pablum as advice, whether God won't give you more than you can handle, or it'll all work out for good. How do you find meaning in your experience? And how would you encourage others to open themselves to experience the same thing?
Well, I will say that in my life, when I found myself wrestling with the absurdity of my condition, because my condition is one, I could be good today and tomorrow I could be, crippled in many ways. Mm-hmm. And so what I've discovered is that it doesn't always and hasn't always made sense to try to make sense. I think sometimes as clergy we're prone to cute cliches at times, especially when we find ourselves empty of words that give people some resolution to their crisis. And so what I realize is that when you're navigating the boundaries of absurdity, cute cliches don't make it, because they don't speak to the essence of the pain that you're dealing with. And what I've discovered was that oftentimes it made no sense for me to try to make meaning in that moment. Because how do you make meaning when there's nothing that makes sense about what you're wrestling with and fighting through? It is difficult. Because there's no way you can try, in your mind, I think initially you try to make meaning of it, to try to find some way to think through it. But when you are in the crucible of pain, it is hard to think through or make meaning. And what I had to learn at a very young age is to just, as I wrote in that piece, to experience the experience and trust that somehow that there will be moments of revelation that come after the journey through that pain is over. And those moments of revelation will give insight, deeper insight, not just to life, but really to yourself. My pain has been a window to my own soul and my own experience and my own identity, because I cannot disconnect from it. And so what I've discovered is that the revelation, the meaning, has come after the experience and after I've survived, because there are things you can convince yourself of that you're going through that will not make sense until you survive the experience. And so that's how I've dealt with it in my life so far. So.
Mm-hmm. Ray, additional thoughts? Any additional thoughts?
I'm just listening to this guy.
Let me ask you both about isolation. In that isolation is itself a form of suffering, but it also tends to accompany suffering and make it deeper and darker. I mean, pain isolates, and I'm sure you've seen this, Ray. Often, parents who lose a child, divorce is more likely. You know, there's something that's deeply isolating about the pain that we go through. From your different perspectives, what role have you seen isolation play in suffering? And what do people who want to help, what do they do? How should they best respond?
You want me to go?
Yeah.
I'll tell you, it's absolutely isolating, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why it's isolating, and I'll come at it from, maybe three different ways, and I say, I'll come at it three different ways. I learned that by teaching in a Divinity school. You say that, and then you hope three things show up, and if they do, you look really smart, because you look like you know what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
But the first thing...
We do that on Sunday morning.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is most definitely that when someone is in a lot of pain, it's hard to be around them. Now, that I can tell you as a physician, because I'm around a lot of people who are in pain. And I had to learn how to do that, how to be present to the suffering of another person. Now, I'm a physician. I walk in and then I walk out. The nurses that I work with walk in and stay for 12 hours. So they have a whole different level of exposure to it. The family members walk in and just stay. And so it's one thing for me to talk about being present to suffering. It's another thing to watch a family member who is around someone who is in pain. I'm sure your wife could say a thing or two about it.
Absolutely.
Who is in pain day in and day out for weeks, for months, for years, maybe all the time. So it's isolating because we don't want to be around other people's pain and suffering. It's isolating because when we're in pain, we don't necessarily want other people to be around us. Sometimes it adds to our sense of pain. When people are coming in and when we have to arrange ourselves to look presentable or to respond to people's questions like, so how are you doing today? On a scale from 1 to 10, how's your pain today? I have had more patients than I could even begin to count roll their eyes when one of my residents walks in and says, so how's your pain on a scale from 1 to 10? Get the out of my room. Leave me alone. I am in pain. So that is most definitely a couple of reasons that we feel isolation. But I'll tell you, there's a deep sense, and I mean this to be tentative. I also mean it to be provocative. And so, in other words, I don't want you to agree with me necessarily. But there's a sense in which, even when you're in pain, okay, maybe there's a pain that shows up, it lasts for a day or two, you're not used to being in pain. You're not, the pain, physical pain, the pain of loss, of grief. But there's a deep sense in which if your situation is such that, well, pain is now just a part of your life, you know what? We still need you in our community. And so there's a sense in which, this is going to be the controversial part maybe, There's a sense in which we still have expectations of you, even though you're in pain, because we need you, and we know it's hard. But as the people who love you and who need you, we are not going to allow you to isolate yourself permanently. Now, I'll give you an example so I've learned, some of the deepest things that I've learned about being a Christian, I've learned either from Judaism or Islam. So I'll tell you one of the stories from Judaism. I have a good friend who's a rabbi, and I was just asking him how, in his particular Jewish community, they cope with the suffering of end of life, when someone has died, and when there's this huge absence. And he said, Ray, he said, I'll tell you exactly how we do it. For the first week, we allow the person who has lost someone to do anything that they want. If they want to hole up in their room, they can. We'll cut the grass, we'll make the food, we'll let the dog out, we'll take care of everything. For 1 week, they can scream, they can curse God, they can read the book of Job out loud. They can do whatever they need to do. But after a week, we move into a different stage where we have an expectation that they begin to resume some of their activities within their home, within their family, because their family needs them. After a month, we have expectations that they will go farther because the larger community needs them. And so one of the ways in our Jewish community that we overcome isolation and respond to grief is to say, we still need you, and so we aren't going to let you isolate yourself. Now, I find that very interesting, because many of us who are around suffering will say, no, it's okay. And we'll say that for days. Maybe that's okay. That's what my Jewish friend said. Sure, a week. We may say that for weeks. That can turn into months. And then it can turn into a way of life. And that's a kind of isolation that as a Christian community, we may want to question. And so I'm just going to put that as a place marker for a question to be discussed later.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I think to hear Ray's perspective is powerful from the person who has been the sufferer, right? Mm-hmm. I for a long time, I've been pastoring now a total of 20 years. And for a long time, I thought that the call to ministry was one of the most insane things I could have experienced in my life, that God clearly did not like me that much, right? Because as a child, going back and forth from the hospital, having visible markings of surgery and scars and children not being too nice, I always found myself not only an introvert, but wanting to be alone a lot. Because at 11, 12, there was no way I thought anyone understood what I was going through. And that was how I functioned for a long time. And my saving grace was my parents allowed me to play sports, and that helped me to become a little bit more open. And then I went to college, and I experienced this, what I know is a call from God to the ministry. And I said to myself, there's no way I could ever pastor because I really don't like people that much, right? So I said, maybe I'll just teach. That was my intention when I went to Duke at this school. And then circumstances happened. I ended up saying to myself, we were struggling, and I said, hey, I need to make some money, so let me go pastor. And so, I love to preach. And at the time, my wife was in a PhD program, and I figured, hey, I said, I'll do this while she's doing the coursework, and then we're going to move, and I'm going to go back to school because I wanted to be a teacher. And I started pastoring this small church in Durham, North Carolina. 3 months into it, I realized this is what I was called to do. And the amazing thing was that church loved me to wholeness. And it helped me realize the deeper meaning to my own condition, because it gave me a way to speak to pain and speak to suffering that I knew intimately. And not only, but the people there loved me while I was going through, saw me in and out of the hospital, saw me battling with my condition. And so in many ways, I realized that part of the key to my own healing and my surviving was coming out of the shell that I wanted to stay in and wanting to be by myself and let these communities nurture me in ways that I did not think was possible because I did not like people, honestly, because many people had been cruel to me. And didn't understand what I was dealing with. And for 20 years, I've been blessed to be in 2 communities now, one in North Carolina and New York, where they showed me the power of carrying your pain in public. And they could not, in many ways, or I cannot necessarily retreat because of the expectation to lead, and I lead through the pain, and I lead through the wounds, and I lead through the hurt. And in many ways, it is the responsibility that I have in the community that won't let me retreat, that gives me strength in the midst of the insanity at times. And so for me, it was knowing that the community that I've been a part of and leading has been the community that delivered me from my desire and my deep longing to be alone. And they made it so that I could not be. And it's the love that pulled me out of that. So.
There's a real mystery to suffering, and Ray, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but often when people are confronted with what seems absolutely senseless and horrifying suffering, it shakes their faith, it shakes their whole sense of what's real, and brings up the whole question of theodicy, the idea that how could a good God allow this? If God is God, he is not good, and if he's good, he's not God type of idea. I'm sure you've seen this with parents of toddlers with cancer. And just wanted to ask both of you, how have you wrestled with that question?
Sounds like a good question for you.
When I was, after I graduated from Duke and I actually started pastoring, and then I started working as a campus minister at Duke, there were some students who came after me who I kind of mentored. And there was one who became a good friend of mine, Steve Lewis. And Steve was engaged to be married, right? And we were all excited. And his fiance took a trip with her girlfriends, I guess, to celebrate her wedding, upcoming wedding. And they went to Bahamas, and she went parasailing. Cable snapped, broke. She came plummeting to the ground with a friend. The friend survived. She drowned. And we were Steve's friends there with him. And we were there when he found out. I was actually there, one of the people who were around when he found out. And he came and talked to many of us. And I heard people say things to him that you would normally say to someone who suffers loss, because at times of loss, you will hear some of the most inappropriate things ever said, and you will hear the worst theology at funerals, right? And so we were talking at the Bryan Center on Duke's campus, and he said, I used to say things like God is good all the time, and all the time God is good, and all these words and ideas and adjectives we would attach to God. And he said, I've come to a place where I just simply know that God is. And I don't have a need to define God after that. God is. And so for me, I remember that conversation because it has shaped me. Because I don't know if I don't think through, well, for many who say, well, Pastor, if God is good, why is this happening? Why is that happening? Why is this happening? How do I make sense of that? And they look to sometimes blame God. And my language that I seek to engage the congregations in is that God is. And there are times when that may not be enough, but there are times where you cannot pigeonhole God into a space and say, well, God is good because what happens when this bad thing happens? Well, God is bad, but what happens when this great thing happens? Knowing that God is and that God's presence means more than God's performance is a powerful thing. That the presence of God means more than the performance of God. And so for me in my life, the presence has helped me make sense. The presence has made the pain bearable. And the presence has helped me find a peace in and with God that helps me then minister to people who are confused and raise the question, what is going on in my life and why is this happening? So,
yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that was a lot of what I meant early on when I was talking about my own struggle, where the conclusion that I ended up coming to is basically God saying, and this is a paraphrase, do you want me or do you want an explanation? And I can tell you right now that anyone who's in the middle of great suffering, there's a role for theodicy. There's definitely a role for working through those sorts of things. And we've got an entire divinity school that's incredibly brilliant at working through those kinds of things. But I can tell you that when I'm sitting in the ICU, which I nearly live in the ICU, the intensive care unit, that's where I spend most of my time when I'm on the medical side. And I ask a parent of a child who's on a ventilator, whose oxygen level is going down, whose oxygen requirement is going up, who now needs intermittent dialysis, who now needs cardiotonic drugs, who seems to be getting worse as organ system after organ system fails. And I say, what are you hoping for? And they say, well, doctor, we're hoping for a miracle. And the reason that they're hoping for a miracle is, of course, because they want their child to live. But the other reason they're hoping for a miracle is because it cannot be possible that a good God would allow my child to die. That's just not possible. Well, this is one of the places where I think we should take very seriously the fact that we live inside a story that tethers us to true things about God, and specifically as Christians, to true things about God that we've seen in the person of Jesus. And so I can say when we're in a situation like that, and I wouldn't say it like this, but I'm going to make it shorter for the sake of this presentation. I can say, do you remember when Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I remember that story. And do you remember him praying? Yep, I remember him praying. Did he pray once? No, he prayed 3 times. Well, what did he pray for? We prayed that this cup would pass. And what was the answer? That's a short version of one of the things that it's important for us to come to as we think about what it is to live suffering from inside the Christian story that Jesus showed us. And so what happened is that Jesus was crucified. And on the cross, Jesus turned to one of the thieves next to him and said one of the most astounding things. He said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Gave him a word of hope. Said that, yes, we're on a cross. Yes, we are dying. But death is not the end of the story. I'm telling you, today you will be with me in paradise. That same Jesus, a little bit later in the day, cried out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, I'll tell you that from within the Christian story, where we learn about the character of God through the person of Jesus, if Jesus can pray 3 times, sweating drops like blood, and be told, no, the cup is not going to pass. If the same Jesus who on the cross can deliver a word of hope to the dying man next to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise," this is not the end of the story. If the same Jesus can cry out, "God, where are you?" then surely it is okay when we are in the middle of our suffering to pray earnestly like Jesus, to accept that sometimes the answer is no. In the middle of suffering, to be open to giving and receiving words of hope, and to allow Jesus' example of holding words of hope and words of loneliness, "My God, where are you?" together. That has got to be okay. Jesus showed us that it's okay. And so even if we can't get to a satisfying theodicy at the end of the day, and there's some good ones, and we can talk about that, and I like talking about them. But in the middle of suffering, that may not finally be the point. we may need to look at Jesus and say, well, what does it look like for Jesus to suffer? That's what it looks like. Pray earnestly. Except that sometimes the answer is no. Speak and receive a word of hope. And be honest. And if what you want to cry is, my God, why have you forsaken me? Then by all means, do. You have a great example to follow.
One of the things about trauma, suffering, is that it tends to blow our circuits in some way. And there are people who say that which does not kill you makes you stronger, but sometimes it merely maims and cripples. There are also those who say once your circuits have been blown, in a sense, you either get bitter or you get better. From where you all have sat, have lived, what distinguishes those who get better from those who get bitter?
Sometimes they're the same people. I'll tell you right now. Sometimes they are the same people.
Yeah.
And it's I would need, so we can hand this one back and forth. But there is in my experience, I've been with thousands of people who have experienced overwhelming suffering and loss and pain. And I have occasionally seen people come through to the other side with a kind of glowing joy that, for me, was a powerful witness, but was a witness in the form of a miracle. The thing that's so surprising because it's somewhat rare. I have never seen anyone utterly closed up in bitterness. But the common thing that I've seen is that in the course of struggle, even for people who get to a place where the struggle is no longer a part of their present life, it's a combination of resilience and resentment. Okay, fine. The election is what it is. I was not going to say that. I don't know what just happened to me. But you get the point.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the rest of it. But I've been both people, bitter and then better. And there were times when being bitter was an upgrade from being suicidal. And I've been there. And I think my battles in the past, when I was at the worst point in my condition, was that I thought I was fraudulent in some ways. Because I would stand to preach a sermon knowing I was angry the night before with God. Or preach on a Sunday and knowing that on Thursday I didn't want to be here anymore. And so here I was in many ways seeking to give hope in a space where I did not feel that hope was possible for me, the condition, the pain, the day in and day out, the medication. And I was tired, and oftentimes the bitterness, once you get past not wanting to be here, the bitterness has to do with fatigue. You're just tired. And so for a long time, being bitter hovered above everything. I'm talking about for a long time, until 2 years ago. I mean, there was always a hopefulness. There was always, I feel good today. And I would speak and preach and teach, and it would give me life. And then I would fall back as soon as my back would hurt, my leg would hurt, or I had to, many times at night, I think I shared this with Ray before, in order to go to sleep, I would have to take a combination of Scalaxin and Vicodin just to sleep. And I was angry at God. It would always renew itself every so often because of my pain level. just that anger, and I would try to hold it and handle it, and I would say all the things to myself. And it's amazing when you find yourself full of words for other people, but empty for yourself. And then something happened 2 years ago, and I'll be very brief. The MRSA that I spoke of in 2012, the sepsis, I experienced it again 2 years later, 2014. And this time it was close when they got me to the hospital, and I was on my way out of here. I think I shared this with you. My blood pressure was like, I think 78/59. And I was out. I passed out, my wife told me. And so what happened is that night I had an incredible pain in my abdomen. And usually if I learned to live with so much pain, and so I tried to ignore it, but I could not sleep. And so I got up, I walked around the house, I went out on the balcony, I did everything. I told my wife, we gotta go. And as I noticed the pain, my abdomen was getting larger. And so I knew something was extremely wrong. And so we go to the hospital, I feel faint on the way there, I get that, pass out. Long story short, the doctors asked me what was wrong. I tell them about my pain. They asked me the questions. Have you ever been hospitalized? I told them yes. I told them I had MRSA and last time, and they decided to do blood cultures. In the process, they took me down and did a scan of my abdomen, and they came back. And the doctor said, your spleen is enlarged, your liver is enlarged, your kidneys are enlarged, you have enlarged lymph nodes in your stomach, your pancreas is enlarged. I mean, all that when this was leading to the growth, how my abdomen was getting larger. And it was extremely painful. It would give me like a heavy dose of Dilaudid, and it was extremely painful. And so the doctor, after the few days, come back and they say, after the cultures come back, you have MRSA again. And the doctor then told me, he said, I'm glad you got to the hospital because your organs were going into shock in some way. You were on your way out of here. If you would have not come here, you might have died in your sleep. And then he said, but there was two things going on. There's the infection that I did not really know I had, and then there was the pain. And the pain was this, and this is the day I stopped being bitter 2 years ago. The pain was that the infection was triggering the organs, but it triggered a sarcoidosis attack. The attack caused the pain and enlarged my organs. If I do not have the attack, if I did not have the pain, I would not have gone to the hospital and I would be dead. And so when I got better, 7 weeks later, and I was trying to find a word to preach back in the pulpit 9 weeks later, and people are waiting, and I'm ready now to preach, and I'm healthy. And I thought it was another cycle, I'm happy, I'm good, and go back down. And then my friend called me and gave me a scripture, and I preached it. The Sunday here was a scripture that changed, and it ended all of my bitterness. It was from the psalmist. It was good that I was afflicted. It was good that I was afflicted. And in all my life, I never had been able to say thank you to my sarcoidosis. But it saved my life. And so my bitterness has been gone. I hadn't experienced it at all because I realized that the thing I despised most was the thing that saved my life. And then it raised other questions. I remember as a little boy, my grandmother, you remember back in the days, I think it was Rex Humbard and all these people on TV preaching, right? And my grandmother, one of those people when I was sick, and she would tell me to come to the TV and put my hand on the TV while he was praying. And I would, because she wanted her grandson healed. And my grandmother would wake me up in the morning, take me downstairs to the living room, and I'd be on my knees like, Grand, I want to sleep. And she had me down there, she's praying. I mean, and then she would get the whole family to come down, and we're going to touch him, and we're going to pray. And I sat there in that hospital, and I said, what if God had answered my grandmother's prayers? My sarcoidosis wasn't present. I would not be here. It was good that I was afflicted. Yeah.
It's time for the most, dynamic part of our evening conversation, which is questions from the audience. So we have Ashley White and Drew with microphones. If you could raise your hand to be called upon and wait to receive a microphone, that would be great. Those of you who have been to Trinity Forum evening conversations before know we have just 3 rules that rule all questions, which is all questions should be brief, should be civil, and should be in the form of a question. So, questions for our 2 panelists. Right there.
Thank you both for coming tonight. I really appreciate the comments you had. One thing that you didn't mention, although Mike, you did it towards the end, is what does the role of gratitude have in dealing with pain and suffering?
Say that again. I didn't hear that.
The role of gratitude.
Oh,
have-
gratitude.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll say this. You come to gratitude. You don't begin there. I arrived at gratitude after years of being angry. And I think gratitude comes at a place in the journey, along the journey, where you discover that there's a deeper meaning to this. And this is what we talked about early in the beginning, that it was only then when I saw that in that moment, on that day, that my condition had a role, that I think my gratitude was genuine. I went through the motions before. God, thank you. I mean, to say thank you when you're on your back is an amazing thing. To say thank you, God, when you're going through. I'll tell you a joke about that. In 2005, I had another infection, and it was one of the most bizarre moments that I've ever experienced in my life. And I shared this with Ray, where I had an open wound, the infection. I had 2 surgeries, had to remove some dead skin, and it kept it open with suction to drain out the infection. And so the doctor was telling me I had to move my arm because my arm hadn't moved in about 6-7 days. And when I started moving the arm, it caused the wound to begin to bleed, and I didn't realize it, and it was hemorrhaging. I mean, it was bleeding bad. And so my wife runs to the nurse. The nurse says, well, I'm in the hospital. She comes in, and now my gown is now soaked. And then the doctor who's attending that night comes in, and he sees it. When he pulled up my gown, and literally some blood shot out from the side. And he sat there, and he's holding it down now. He's trying to stop the bleeding, and he yells out to the nurse to get some lidocaine. He said, I got to close this wound. And this is like a movie, right? And because what I'm going to tell you doesn't even seem real. It seems like a movie. And so he says, get some lidocaine. I'm sitting there in and out. I'm feeling I'm about to pass out. The blood is just, I'm in a pool of blood now, right? And she comes back with 1 vial, and she says, there's no more on the floor. She gives it to him. She goes down to get some. He injects it, but it's not enough. And he looked at me, and he said, I have to close it. And there was no anesthetic. And he starts closing the wound there in the room. And my wife is sitting there holding my hand. She's a good Baptist, right? That's all I can say with that. Watch this, and she's holding my hand, and she says, just give God praise. And I looked at her, and I said, hell no. Because there was nothing to give God praise about. The man was stitching me with no anesthetic. And he managed to do 3 before they came back. I mean, so no. There was no glory to be given. There was no gratitude in that moment. I was hurting. Gratitude is a difficult disposition when you're being broken by your pain. It is only when you begin to see some other meaning, some deeper meaning, when you are pushed to a place when your back is no longer against the wall, when you can say thank you. But anything before that would have been me being deeply dishonest about what I felt. No, I was not grateful. I was mad that this man was stitching me with no anesthetic. So yeah, gratitude, you come to it. You don't begin with it. And rather, you pray, you discover it along the journey.
Yeah.
Other questions? Over here in the corner.
So earlier we talked about Jesus showing us how to live through the suffering, and how if we want a picture of who of God is, to look at Jesus. What about in Luke, I was reading this morning, in Luke 18, how he talks to the blind beggar and says, what do you want from me? He says, I want to be healed, I want my sight. He says, go in faith, go and your faith has healed you. How do you reconcile that with, not being healed of some things that you ask for when Jesus says, what do you want from me?
Well, I would say when Jesus says, tell me what you want, tell him. And it sounds like the answer in that case was yes. But I'll tell you, so here's my Muslim story. I was in the intensive care unit, and I have a lot of Muslim stories because I've learned so much. But I was in the intensive care unit, and I was asked to come and talk with a family whose child had been through bone marrow transplant. And this child was on a ventilator, was on something called CVVHD, which is a continuous form of dialysis, was on pressors, which are medicines to keep your blood pressure up, and was still having evidence of progressive organ failure. He had been on steroids for a long time because he was in bone marrow transplant, which means that his bones were brittle. He had something called osteopenia. They were easy to break. And the intensive care unit was concerned that if the child's heart stopped, they would be obligated to go in and begin doing chest compressions. Well, now, if they did chest compressions on this child, the first thing that's going to happen is that every rib in this child's chest is going to break. And those ribs are going to be poked into the child's lungs, and the child is going to get a pneumothorax. We give sedation when you're on the ventilator. We give you enough sedation for you to be asleep while you're on the ventilator. We don't give you enough sedation for you to stay asleep while every rib in your body is being broken. You will wake up. And so the last experience this child would have would be of his chest being broken. But it would not change a thing about the fact that his heart had stopped. And rightly, the intensive care unit was concerned about this because this was suffering without benefit. And they were concerned that the child's last experience was going to be of pain and terror. And they wanted to avoid that. So they gave me a page. And they said, hey, Ray, would you come talk to this family? Because we don't want to do this, but they won't listen to us. Well, I'd never met them before. I had no idea what I was going to say. I'm not Muslim. I didn't know these folks. And so I said, well, sure, I'll come talk to them. So I walked in the room, and it was the dad there, standing next to his son. And there was this music that was playing in the room, this beautiful music. And so because I am skilled in communication, I found a connection point. And I said, what beautiful music. And the dad said, it's not music. I said, well, what is it? And he said, it's chanting. I said, well, what are they chanting? He said, the Quran. Well, I'm trying to find my little way in. So I said, well, what part of the Quran are they chanting? So he listened for a minute. And he said, they're chanting the part of the Quran that says, there are things that we want in this life. And sometimes God's answer is yes, and sometimes God's answer is no. But whether God's answer is yes or God's answer is no, praise be to God. There's a starting point for a conversation. Now, the thing is that I believe in miracles. I have no doubt that the creator of the universe at any moment can do whatever the creator of the universe wishes to do in any particular situation. I have also been a pediatric oncologist for 14 years. And I've had a lot of children who've died. I've also had a lot of children who haven't died. I can tell you that if I was older and I was practicing back in 1955, I would have 0 children who survived lymphoblastic leukemia. Right now at Duke University, our cure rate for standard risk in lymphoblastic leukemia is approaching 90%. That is not because God suddenly got interested in curing children in 2016, but didn't care about curing children in 1955. So something else is going on. I believe in a loving creator. And I believe in the power of that Creator to do miracles. And I believe that we are called to pray like children, to ask for what's genuinely in our heart, to say, Jesus, I want to see. Because to say anything else would be to be something less than truthful. Just like he was saying. When Mike says, yeah, gratitude comes, but when it comes because you're now grateful. Not because someone told you ought to be grateful. Does that make sense? This is an answer to the question. This really is an answer to the question. Because you're going to have to hold both things together. Jesus performed a miracle on that day. Sometime later, Jesus' own prayer received an answer, which was no. Somehow we've got to wrestle with the truth that Jesus loved children in 1955 with lymphoblastic leukemia and loves children in 2016 with lymphoblastic leukemia. As Christians, we have to come up with better ways of living out our faith on the inside of things that are true. And so that's my not very satisfying answer.
Lorenzo.
Good evening. Thank you. You all talked about suicide. You talked about despair, but you also talked about hope and believing in miracles. And my question is, there's legislation going around this country. I think 5 states have already passed what's called Death with Dignity. And D.C. just passed, I think the city council just voted, I think 11-2 to pass it as well. And other states are about to deal with it, Maryland in particular, I think in the next session. And so I just wanted to ask you, and you know, with your personal experience, especially you, Doctor, and you, Reverend, as well, in dealing with patients who are about to experience death, if you could help me understand, you know, why, or if that is a good thing to be able to say, if I am terminally ill and I'm going to die within, I think the bill says within 6 months, then I should be allowed to terminate my life. And I'm personally struggling with this, and I'd just like to know what you all think about that.
Well, I'll answer that briefly. You know, because this is something we're going to have to keep struggling with, because it's not obvious to me. I will tell you that as a Christian physician, I have never hastened someone's death, doing something with the intention of hastening someone's death. There have been many times where I have had patients with intractable pain, and I have done things to treat their intractable pain that I'm quite sure hasten their death. And my intent was to treat their pain. I had a child, I could tell you 1,000 stories like that. I had a child, a 12-year-old, with something called angiosarcoma, who I was treating in the intensive care unit. And he was in continual pain, 24 hours a day. Angiosarcoma, it's a cancer that was slowly growing up in his bones. It was going to take a long time to kill him, but it would kill him. And he was in outrageous pain. He would cry round the clock. His mom had to leave the intensive care unit and go back to the apartment that we had provided for her because she could not bear to be around the crying of her son. So he'd get on the phone and he would call her on the cell phone so that he could cry into the phone. And this went on for weeks. So I tried a couple of things. I tried a massive dose of fentanyl, something called sufentanil, that was running at the highest dose that I've ever given to anyone. It didn't touch his pain. Then I tried something called ketorolac. Another name for it's Toradol. It's in the same class of medicines as Motrin. It's bad for your kidneys. Turns out that if I gave it at very high doses, it was the only thing that relieved his pain. The problem is that if I give it for very long, his kidneys will shut down. If I stopped it, his pain came back. And so I made a decision. He wanted it. His mom wanted it. And I made a decision to give it to him. And it brought him back into the arena of being able to communicate with his mom and not being in excruciating pain 24 hours a day. And his kidneys failed. And I am quite certain that he died early because I just kept giving it to him until he died. I find this to be a very difficult question, and I won't kid you about it. And I'll tell you who just made it even harder, a man that I respect deeply, Bishop Desmond Tutu, who said, I am grateful at the idea of being able, at the end of my life, if I am in deep pain, of bringing my life to a quicker close, of having that as a choice. I don't quite know what to do with that because I have profound regard for the moral judgment of Bishop Desmond Tutu. And when Desmond Tutu tells me that he finds some consolation in the possibility of help dying quickly at the end of his life, especially in the face of intractable pain, I don't know quite what to do. But I will tell you that as of today, as a Christian physician, I will not participate in euthanasia, but I will do everything in my power to help you not have pain, if that's one of your goals.
Can I say something very quickly to that? Very quickly. It is, Dean Campbell is here, so I have to say this. And when we were first-year students at Duke Div, we had to take CM10. And Dean Campbell gave the lecture, and there's something he said I shared with Ray that has stayed with me all the years that I've been in ministry and pastoring. And he said that in many ways, as the resident theologian, you have to lead theologically. I'll never forget that line. You lead theologically, which means then that in that moment, and based on the question you raised, part of the challenge for the pastor, the religious leader, the faith person that they go to, is for the person who's thinking this, all right? I have terminal cancer, I'm gonna die, I'd rather end it early. The assumption is that with the terminal cancer and the pain, that there's no value anymore. And so I would have to, in that scenario, help the person find value with the terminal, right, disease or condition, to find value in the moments they do have, so that it doesn't seem like a waste to keep on breathing. And I know I can speak to that because I know what it's like when you feel like, hey, I'm tired. But at the same time, it has taken small things that have helped me, even when the doctors did not know what to do and told me that it could be a matter of days. There were small things that I could look at, reflect on, think about, remember, that found value even in the insanity, that made the days of pain bearable. And so the role at that moment is to see how does the individual, or push the individual to find value, as opposed, because I do not support, as you said, the same, I do not believe in euthanasia. I do not support that. But I believe in helping a person who may be dying find value, because I've seen it too much, where value and meaning and power and strength were present until the last breath. And that meant something. So.
I have a feeling there are many more questions in this room, but we're going to have to wrap up. And as we do so, I thought maybe both of you could give us a quick word, and it's kind of a final summation. Compassion literally means suffering with. Based on your own experience, what advice would you give to all of us in the room on how to show wise compassion in terms of suffering with others?
I could use a young lady who raised the question over here, her example of Jesus. I think when we see people who are suffering, the worst thing you can do is make assumptions about their suffering, right? It is why Jesus said, what would you have me to do? I'm not going to assume that the blindness is your condition, if you get that, right? So it is, I'm not going to assume that what I see is the problem. And so to have compassion, to suffer with, I think in many ways, is to not make assumptions and to be present in ways that are beneficial to the individual. That's what it means to be with them, not to assume you know them or you understand what they're going through. And that way, the greatest ministry you can offer someone is a ministry of presence in those moments. To me, that's what compassion is, to not make assumptions, but to be present and to be there with the individual, right? And to not assume you understand, but to learn from the person. Because just because I'm okay now and you're not, doesn't mean there's nothing to be learned in our commonality in that moment. And so I would say that.
Right.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that, if compassion means to suffer with, then the likelihood is you're going to suffer. Because to be with someone who is in the middle of pain or of depression or of debilitating anxiety or some other form of agony, to be genuinely present to them, to be open in the sense that you were talking about, but to be genuinely present to them, to suffer with, probably means that you're going to suffer. It's difficult, but stay. I nearly left medicine at one point because I had thought of compassion as a thing that I do, that I bring into the room and dispense. I'm now dispensing compassion. But if it genuinely just means walking in the room and suffering with, it means that I probably need to just sit down and stay. And I did stay. I didn't leave. And I stayed, and I stayed, and I stayed until the suffering taught me. By suffering, not the suffering, the sufferer, the one suffering. Until they taught me that they were giving me a gift. That compassion is not something that I come in and dispense, but that suffering with is something we do together. And at some point, I'm going to be on the other end. But it's a reciprocal kind of thing. And so I would say, in answer to your question, it takes some skill. It's a thing that is learned. And the way that you learn a thing is by doing it and continuing to do it even if you're doing it badly. So I would say if you have someone in your life who's suffering and you want to practice compassion, then go in and do it badly. And do it badly until they've shown you how to do it well.
Michael, Ray, thank you so much. As we wrap up, I just want to direct everyone's attention to an invitation that should be on each of your chairs to join the Trinity Forum Society. We invite you to be part of a society that makes conversations like this possible. And in the midst of a society, a culture, a city that is polarized, that is characterized by both triviality, vulgarity, and belligerence in public discourse, we try to provide a space where people can grapple together with what matters most in a manner that is both civil, rigorous, and warmly hospitable. And all of our members help make that possible. And so we invite you to join us in that. As a special benefit, if you join tonight, feel free to pick any of the readings outside that you'd like to take as a benefit. We particularly recommend Simone Weil's Wrestling with God, which deals with this particular topic. In addition, I just wanted to, it's always appropriate to end with thanks, and certainly there are many people to thank tonight. Most particularly our speakers, Ray and Michael, thank you so much. We very much appreciate the partnership of Duke Divinity School and Dan Struble. It's a pleasure to meet with you, to work with you, as well as our sponsors, Peter McDonald. I'd also like just to thank my colleagues who do such an excellent job with each of these. Colleen O'Malley, Alyssa Abraham, Ashley White, our fantastic interns, Nancy Ritter and Amy Troutman, as well as our volunteers tonight, Betsy Poole from Duke Divinity, Lissy McClanahan, Jenny Heidel, and our intern emeritus, Drew Masterson. Thank you also to Zach Miller and Zach Miller Photography, to our speakers, and to all of you here. We so appreciate your coming, and good night. Thank you, Michael.